Hey everybody, it's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and I wanted to go ahead and usher in 2019, the new year, with a look back at some of my favorite limited cards from 2018. This starts all the way with Rivals of Exelon, which I credit as a set that came along and fixed one of the worst sets I've ever played in my Magic career, which was just Triple Exelon. We also had the two Master sets, we had the Return of the Core set, we had the short-lived but fantastic Battlebond set, and of course, our two most recent large expansion sets, Guilds of Ravnica and Daman Area, which I found both to be fantastic. We got a bunch of awesome cards out of this, and you'll see at least one card from each of these sets. And this is not scripted. This is just my opinion about the cards, why I enjoyed them, and hopefully we'll get some cards like this in the coming up year with Ravnica Allegiances kicking off in a couple weeks. Feel free to leave any comments, any likes, whatever you want to say, any feedback, I'm open to it. And you can also find us on Twitter at MTG_Manarock. So logistics out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the first card on this list, Helm of the Host. So Helm of the Host is the card that I credit with getting me to day 2 at Grand Prix Las Vegas. This card is absurd. If you've played with it, you know that it just dominates the game. And if you've played against it, sometimes it feels hopeless. Plus, there was not a lot of artifact destruction in Daman Area, and this was a colorless card, so you would just first pick it and play it in any deck. It had the unique ability to make multiples of a legendary creature, which we really don't get that ability a lot, and this could lead to some really awesome things. Some of the coolest things I saw was Helm of the Host on Adelies, which lets you build a board of Adelies, and they all pump each other whenever you cast an instant or sorcery. At Grand Prix Las Vegas, I managed to stick this on an Arvad and probably ended the game with 5 or 6 Arvads on board. The one that was equipped got +2/+2 from each of the other ones, although keep in mind, the tokens are not legendary, so they don't all get pumped, but it's still kind of nice to just make a free Arvad every turn of the game. Joyra was another recipient of the Helm of the Host that led to some really cool interactions. If you have 3 Joyras, 4 Joyras on board, and you start casting historic spells, you basically draw a new hand every single turn. Quite absurd. And I have even watched in a 2-headed giant game a friend of mine play Helm of the Host on Torgar and keep resetting their own life total to 10 so that they didn't die to their opponent's Slimefoot, which also had Helm of the Host on it. Just think about that interaction for a second. So yeah, pure power level here was nice. It wasn't so dominant that it couldn't be beat, but you could stick this on basically anything, even a token, and just win a game out of nowhere, even if it took a couple turns. And I had the pleasure of teaching some newer players the power level of cards like this, especially colorless cards that can go in any deck. Next up is Sarkhan's Unsealing from the core set. I'm on record for saying I don't really care for the core sets very much. I like them as kind of a necessary addition to Magic that allows new players kind of a place to come into Limited, come into Constructed without super complex rules. And for that, I like that they're there, but I don't necessarily enjoy playing them due to their simplistic nature. But then you get these rares and build-arounds like Sarkhan's Unsealing, which completely blow open games. If you remember, this is the enchantment that says whenever you cast a creature with power 4, 5, or 6, you get to shoot anything on the board or an opponent for 4 damage. And if you cast one of the bigger creatures with 7 or more power, you get to shoot everything for 4, including the opponent and their planeswalkers, which is absurd. This was the type of card that if you first picked it, suddenly you were taking Onake Ogres really early on, and they went from super mediocre to some of the better cards in your deck, right? Turning every single creature in your deck into a Flametongue Kavu was absurd, and once you killed all your opponent's creatures, you just shoot them for 4 every time you cast a creature. Obviously, you could get some of the bigger creatures like Inferno Helion or Gaspark Twins, and for extra mileage, you could draft one of the rares like Gigantosaurus, or I guess even Chromium would fit the bill here. If you watched any of my Core Set 2019 draft videos on Mana Rocks, you noticed I think I did somewhere around 7 to 8 videos for M19, and about half of them involved Sarkhan's Unsealing, which tend to be my pet card for the limited format. I opened it quite often, which honestly, you could open worse cards than Sarkhan's Unsealing. Next up on our list from Masters 25 is a reprint, one of 2 reprints, I believe, that I put on my list. And that is Zadahedron Grinder. So this was originally a rare in Battlebond and Dominaria. And if you're not familiar with the card, it's a 4-mana 3/3 that essentially says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery that only targets Zada, you get to copy that for all of your other creatures as well. So if you use a pump spell and Zada is the only target, that pump spell reflects or rebounds onto all of your other creatures. It was a rare before, but being downshifted to uncommon in Masters 25 opened up a lot more possibilities, and you could draft it a lot more often. In the original format, Battle for Zendikar and Oath of the Gatewatch, really the only cool thing you could do with it was slip through space or expediate to draw a bunch of cards, which was cool, right? But again, Zada was a rare there, so this wouldn't come together very often, and it was in the last pack you would draft, so you only had one shot to get it if you had a deck at the end of the draft in the third pack, right? But in Masters 25, they added cards like Uncaged Fury and Invigorate, which just kind of went off with Zada. If you ever cast Invigorate on Zada, that was almost enough to win the game on its own. In addition to that, Masters 25 had cards like Hordling Outburst and ways to make tokens, so you could really take advantage of Zada in a way that you couldn't in its original format. And I have a soft spot for Zada. I've had a commander deck with Zada as the lead of that deck. So being able to play in a limited format and combo off with it felt really nice. I was not a huge fan of the limited format for Masters 25. Overall, it was kind of bland and not very exciting. But some of the downshift and rarities that we see in these Master sets lead to some combinations that you don't get in the original printing of those cards. And for that reason, I really enjoyed playing with the Hedron Grinder in Masters 25. Following that up, we have a card that I think most people would at least think about when it comes to Dominaria and their favorite cards from the set, and that is the Eldest Reborn. First off, I think we're all in compliance that the sagas from Dominaria were a hit. Most of them, while some of them were a little bit unplayable, most of them were pretty fun, and just the idea of ticking up chapters one at a time, having like a miniature planeswalker and having these powerful effects at uncommon and rare, not even just mythic rare, seemed like it was a lot of fun, and it was just an enjoyable experience to draft a card like the Eldest Reborn or Song of Freyalise and have this super powerful effect. And the Eldest Reborn was basically a mini Cruel Ultimatum, right? For 5 mana, you would make your opponent sack a creature, make them discard a card, and then reanimate a creature or planeswalker from anyone's graveyard. And while that happened all individually, the overall effect of this card seemed like something you were expecting out of a rare, or maybe even a mythic. Probably not mythic, but like the fact that this was uncommon was just absurd to me. There were certain combos you could pull off too, like having Muldrotha. If you are the type of person who opens mythic rares, Muldrotha was just ridiculous with sagas, and the Eldest Reborn in particular. If they ever killed Muldrotha, you get it back with the Eldest Reborn's third chapter, and then you can replay the Eldest Reborn with Muldrotha as your enchantment for the turn. Pretty absurd if you ask me. There was also the mini combo of Tragic Poet, where you could Eldest Reborn back the Tragic Poet on Chapter 3, and then sack the Poet to get the Reborn back, and just loop that ad infinitum, right? It was super fun. I think most people will remember the Eldest Reborn fondly, and actually it's entered the standard fray a little bit against some of the more controlling decks, or some of the more prominent hexproof creatures that we see. So, super glad to have played with this card, and I think if we ever do flashback Dominaria drafts, this will be one of the cards that I'm hoping to open. Next up is actually a 2-for-1. It's a combination of cards that I'm assuming some people don't actually know about, considering they came from Battlebond. This is Will and Rowan Kenrith, the 6-mana Planeswalker partners from Battlebond. For those of you who don't know, the way Partner With worked is if you cast, let's say, Will Kenrith, it has the mechanic Partner with Rowan Kenrith. This would allow you to target either yourself or your partner to go fetch up Rowan Kenrith. So if you and your partner in the Two-Headed Giant game had one of each of these planeswalkers in their decks, then either time you or your partner cast one, the other person could go fetch theirs, which with the mythic rare planeswalkers was absolutely ridiculous. These cards dominate the board. They make combat really miserable for your opponent, and they have these +2 effects that really mess up your opponent's ability to use their creatures effectively. Will Kenrith turns 2 of your opponent's creatures into 0/3s with no abilities until your next turn. It can also target any player to draw 2 cards and make some of their spells cheaper for the turn. And the emblem, which targets a player, you can use it on your partner, allows them to copy all of their instants and sorceries for the rest of the game. Rowan Kenrith, on the other hand, another 6-mana planeswalker, forces all of your opponent's creatures to attack. And remember, in Two-Headed Giant, this only forces one person's creatures to attack, but they have to attack you if able. And the -2 allows you to deal 3 damage to each of their tapped creatures. And the -8, similar to Will Kenrith, allows you to target a player to get an emblem which copies all of their activated abilities, including their Planeswalker abilities. These two in combination was absurd, and the fact that partner with meant if one of your players, either you or your partner, drew one, you would always have access to the second one, meant as long as you're not getting mana screwed, you get to play these both on the same turn and just really turn the tide, especially with Rowan Kenrith's -2 ability. You get to just take down teams very quickly. Me and my partner had the fortune of opening these in our Two-Headed Giant event, one of the many we did, one time, and anytime we cast either of them, we just dominated the board with both of them. I think Battlebond really didn't get its time in the sun because a lot of the mechanics were cool, especially the partner with mechanic, but there was also things like assist and ways to really utilize the Two-Headed Giant format to its fullest. So I wish we would see a little bit more Battlebond, or at least a set similar to this that had a little bit more time to shine. It did come out in the summer right after Daman Area, but it was quickly overshadowed, and it was so, I guess, prevalent as a set with reprints and just new cards that people wanted that it sold out so quickly that you really can't get copies. But if you ever have a chance to draft Battlebond, be on the lookout for your partners, and it's just a fun experience overall. Will and Rowan go down as possibly the strongest cards in the set, in my opinion, that you can open. And as a side note, whenever you open one partner, you always open the other with it. So there you go. You open one Planeswalker, boom, you get to play with 2. So I've only included one card from this list out of Guilds of Ravnica, and that is Thief of Sanity. For what it's worth, my opinion about Guilds of Ravnica is that it's a solid set. It's fun to play. Maybe not the most fun to actually draft, since, you know, you take a Dimir card and suddenly you're drafting Dimir. But I think Guilds of Ravnica will be one of those sets that's solid, it's good, but people won't really remember too much of it moving forward, or a couple years from now, Guilds of Ravnica won't have contributed too much to things like Commander, and so on and so forth. But Thief of Sanity is a card that really sticks out from the set for me, and possibly my favorite card from the set. So I am not alone in saying that taking your opponent's cards and using them against them is one of the most fun strategies you can do, right? Look at some of the cards reprinted or printed in the last couple of years. Obviously, Thief of Sanity was kind of an upgrade to Night Veil Spectre, but we recently got Gonti and cards like Mind's Dilation out of sets within the last 4 to 5 years, and Wizards always seems to include at least one card in each set that lets you play with your opponent's cards, and cards like Thief of Sanity and Gonti have even adapted from their older versions to allow you to cast those cards with any color of mana. Thief of Sanity, being a 3-drop with evasion that lets you do this every time it hits, was just ridiculous. If you've ever played against Thief of Sanity and it dealt combat damage to you, you probably felt like you were losing the game on the spot. That's not exactly what happens, but if it ever gets one hit, they're already up a card, and if it ever gets more than one hit, you're probably losing that game, right? Thief of Sanity is great. It was also in the best color combination, according to most people, Dimir, and even though it didn't have the Dimir mechanic of Surveil, it did a pretty good job of just being a Dimir-feeling card, right? It's a thief, it fits the guild's mechanic, it's a fun card to play with, maybe not the most fun card to play against, but it was statted perfectly, and it allowed you to get an advantage over the opponent. Slam dunk, first pick bomb, always happy to see it, and I would not complain if we saw more cards like this moving forwards. And our second reprint on this list, card I may be mispronouncing, is Shirai, Shizu's Caretaker. This was reprinted in Ultimate Masters, the most recent set we've had, even though it's probably a little bit of a flash in the pan. For those of you who don't know what Shirai does, it's 4 and a black for a 2/2, a little bit on the sketchy side there. And it's a legendary creature at uncommon here. It says, whenever a creature with power 1 or less is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, you return it to the battlefield beginning the next end step, but only if Shirai is still on the battlefield. So it doesn't trigger when it itself dies, and if Shirai dies before the end step, you won't get those creatures back. Now, just like Zada Hedron Grinder, I love when they reprint these legendary creatures and downshift them in rarity. it gives people a little bit more flexibility on how often they can draft it in a limited set and what they can do with it. Now, in Ultimate Masters, we had cards like Fume Spitter and Martyr of Sands, which were creatures that fit Shirai's power condition while also having effects that sacrifice themselves. With Fume Spitter, you could sacrifice it, put a -1 counter on an opponent's creature. On the end step, you get Fume Spitter back, and then on the opponent's turn, you do the same thing. You get it back on end step, and every turn cycle, you could sacrifice Fume Spitter twice to throw 2 -1/-1 counters around. You could even do cool things where you could use Fume Spitter on your own creatures to shrink them down to 1 power and then kill them off. Things like Eternal Witness would die to Fume Spitter's ability, but then they would come back because they had 1 power when they died, and you could use Shirai to loop the Fume Spitter and loop whatever creatures you were shrinking on your side of the board. It didn't come up too often, obviously, because Shirai is a 2/2 for 5 mana. Very easy to kill in a set that had things like Fiery Temper and Fire Ice, but when it did work out, it was pretty sweet. There was also Martyr of Sands, which, for those of you who don't know, allows you to reveal any number of white cards in addition to sacrificing itself from your hand, and then you gain 3 times that many cards, or 3 times that much life. So if you reveal 3 cards, you gain 9 life. And then the Martyr of Sands just pops back onto the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. And you can do this once during your turn, once during your opponent's turn. There were a couple other minor combos with Shirai, including just having your creatures die when they've been shrunk in combat. But for the most part, these were the 2 main ones. And honestly, this leads to a strategy all in itself. If your opponent can't kill Shirai, then the Fume Spitter does take over the game and just shrinks their board by 2 every single turn. It makes it really difficult for them to actually stick creatures on board. It was fun. I had never played the set that Shirai was originally from, one of the Kamigawa sets. I think Betrayers, but I might be wrong. So having access to an older card in a newer format that I've never played with in its older format, for me, was fun. And while, again, Ultimate Masters is not my favorite set, it was definitely better than Masters 25, and it had a lot of cool things going for it. And Shirai sticks out as one of the cards that made for some really niche, interesting strategies in that format. Alright, we're back to Dominaria again. What can I say? Dominaria was easily the best set of 2018, barring Battlebond as kind of a gimmick set. But we got to give a shout out to our Russian merfolk Tatyova, Benthic Druid, our good old 5-mana 3/3 landfall creature that gains a life and draws a card. This is the type of effect you would see on a mythic rare in basically any set. And it felt mythic, right? The fact that Tatyova was uncommon, along with some of the other uncommons in the set, we already talked about the Helfer Reborn, but cards like Slimefoot and Adeliz, these are cards you would normally see at rare, but Tatyova at uncommon was just mind-blowing, in my opinion. This card was great, and it had a couple combos in cards like Grow from the Ashes, but look at what you would expect out of a mythic landfall creature from another set. Cards like Undergrowth Champion just are not even close to Tatyova's power level, and that was a mythic rare landfall creature. Sure, Tatyova doesn't have the word landfall on it, but let's be real, it's a landfall creature, and it's just great. You could start off a draft, you could splash it, you could play it in your blue-green deck and just have a solid deck, and anytime you played Tatyova and it lived for more than a turn, you were going to get so much value off of it. And it felt ridiculous. Sometimes you would be losing a game, you would stick Tatyova on turn 5 and it would survive, and then through the next couple turns you would draw so many extra cards and gain enough life to stay alive that you could win that game. I think most people, even new players, see the power level of a card like Tatyova, and having that at uncommon was just kind of absurd in my opinion, but I'm glad we did. Part of the reason Dominaria was such a hit is because it had these super powerful cards pushed at uncommon, and that let everybody play with a powerful deck, and sometimes you just clash your Tatyovas against your opponent's uncommon, mythic rare uncommons, if you will, and it led to some really awesome gameplay. Obviously, Grow from the Ashes with Tatyova is sick, and anytime you got to do that, you felt like you were living a dream. Okay, I already mentioned that Rivals of Exelon came around and fixed what I consider to be one of the worst formats I've ever played with. Triple Exelon I hated, but Rivals of Exelon somehow managed to twist that around a complete 360. I guess 180, right? And turn it into something I love. And part of the reason was just these huge creatures like Zakama Primal Calamity. Now, I'm going to go out and make sure it's known that I never once had the opportunity to actually draft Zakama Primal Calamity. I never opened it in a pack. It was unfortunate, but the card is so cool and I absolutely love it. I love the design of it, that it has 3 unique activated abilities. It lets you use those abilities right away. It has very pumped up power and toughness, and it rewards you for the 9 mana that you're spending to cast this card. 9 mana is a lot, and when I play a 9 mana card, I want it to win the game, but I don't necessarily want it to just have the text "you win the game" on it, right? I still want to work for my wins, even though working for 9 mana is pretty close to me wanting to just win the game when I cast my card. I don't mind doing a little bit of extra work, and Zakama gave you the tools to do that. Either you gain a bunch of life to stay in the game, or you destroy a bunch of creatures, you take out some problematic artifacts and enchantments. Whatever combination of effects you needed to do, Zakama probably gave you the choice to do it. Now, I've played against the card, and it's not particularly cool card to see your opponent resolve since, yeah, you're going to lose that game, right? But it didn't have haste or anything. It wasn't pushed over the top for 9 mana. It still made you wait a turn, kind of react to what your opponent was doing, and then try to win the game. It also just died to removal spells, or at least some number of them. Remember, Rivals of Exelon had Impale, 4 mana, destroy target creature at common. So the fact that Zakama wasn't invincible leads me to like it a lot more. We saw cards like Omniscience and Conflux, these 8, 9, 10 mana cards that you see in sets that just don't really do that much. They're either there for constructed purposes or for some really gimmicky limited deck that just doesn't ever come together. And it feels bad to have those cards and never really want to play them, right? They're supposed to be cool, they're supposed to be flashy, and sometimes they're there for constructed, but if I draft an Omniscience, I know I'm never going to play it, right? Whereas Zakama is an example of a 9 mana card that I'm happy to put in the deck and try to make it work, right? It really pays you off for spending the absurd amount of mana that you have to pay it. So shout out to Rivals of Exelon and some of its bigger payoff cards, which I'll mention here again in just a second. But Zakama, one of the cooler cards in the set, even if I never really got a chance to play it. And before we move on to the final card, my favorite card from 2018 for Limited, I wanted to go ahead and give just a few honorable mentions, starting with the Sailor of Means. This card spawned a whole deck and allowed you to do kind of the 5-color nonsense deck in Rivals of Exelon. Sailor of Means was originally from Exelon and it was reprinted in both sets, but Rivals of Exelon is where it really shined. In addition to having just the Elder Dinosaurs and some of the more expensive cards and multicolor cards, Sailor of Means just let you cast those cards, and it wasn't until probably halfway through the format that people started dubbing the Sailor of Means deck as something that you could actually draft, and it worked out, right? Plus the fact that you could just pick up extra Sailor of Means in the Exelon pack really added to the deck's viability. Play of the Game from Battlebond was an 8-mana Board Wrath. It had Assist, which means that your partner, or your opponent if they're dumb, could help you pay for as much of the generic mana as possible, so you and your partner could split the cost 4 and 4 and exile every non-land permanent. When you have an effect like this, a board sweeper and 2-headed giant, and you and your partner are allowed to play around it, then you can actually dominate a game. Me and my friend managed to win a game off the back of basically just this card on its own, and then a bunch of dorky creatures that we followed up with. It is that strong, but ultimately it is just a Board Wrath, so it's not taking one of my top spots, just a card that lives up to its name. It really is the play of the game when you cast it. And then finally, Traxos, Scourge of Krug. If you know me personally, you know that I love gigantic mechanical monsters and creatures, things like Ramos, Wormcoil Engine, things that are just huge and gigantic. Progenitus is another example that comes to mind. And I love Traxos. I don't necessarily love that it was a 7/7 and in the same set as Onsera's Wings, which felt pretty unbeatable. But if you go watch one of my first, maybe it was my first Daman Area draft on Mana Rocks, I got to assemble the combo. And wow, did it feel sweet when it happened. So Traxos, not necessarily one of the best cards, and it did have a little bit of a draft in or deck restriction. You had to draft enough heroic cards to make it actually untap, but Dominaria was full of heroic cards, including legendaries and cheap artifacts that Traxos could often dominate a board. I don't think I ever saw a game where Traxos came down on turn 4 and didn't win the game, but hey, it was possible, and I think this card ultimately was fair, fun, and a lot of people enjoyed playing with it. So what is the number one? My favorite card from 2018? It's my boy Arcades the Strategist. Okay, I love the Defender theme, right? I love taking a mechanic or a rule of Magic the Gathering and flipping it on its head, which is exactly what Arcades does. For those of you who don't remember, this is the Bant Elder Dragon from Core Set 2019. It's the 3/5 Flying Vigilance. It lets your defenders attack as though they didn't have Defender. It lets you draw a card whenever your defenders come into play, and it lets your defenders deal damage based on their toughness rather than their power. So very Doran-esque effect. Assault Formation from Dragons of Tarkir is also one of my favorite cards of all time. I absolutely love the ability to take these cards that are designed to have high toughness and low power as their kind of fixed qualities, and then turn that on its head and turn them into absolutely ridiculous creatures. Also, Suspicious Bookcase, which could have easily taken an honorable mention slot on its name alone, was a card that fit here, as well as Wall of Mist, Wall of Vines. You know, as soon as your opponent plays Wall of Vines into Suspicious Bookcase, that there's going to be an Arcades at some point, and you need to deal with that. On top of that, Arcades was a viable standard deck, even if like maybe a 2.5 or tier 3 standard deck. You could build a deck with enough defenders to make it work, and it'll be getting a support card in Ravnica Allegiances in the form of a 3-mana enchantment that allows your defenders to attack. So maybe there's an actual deck there. But for limited purposes, the fact that you could take Arcades first pick and then wheel cards like Wall of Vines, cards that nobody else is going to want, and have a real deck on your hands was really fun to me. It spawned an entire commander archetype as well, the Bant Defenders list that I'm sure nobody was playing, and it gave you an alternative to Doran, which is less defender based and more just high toughness based, right? Arcades is a fun card. I love it. I was gushing about it when it came out, and I got to draft it a grand total of once in all of Core Set drafting, but it was fun when it happened. It was even fun when I played against it, having to figure out how to beat a bunch of walls, i.e. play flyers. But Arcades came down as a 3/5, attacked and blocked with Vigilance, and even your flyer strategy had trouble getting through that. So, number one spot goes to Arcades here, and I think that's a well-deserved spot. I love the card, fun design. I would like to see more of this in the future. So that covers it for 2018. Those are my favorite cards, the cards that are going to stick with me from the previous year. And I'm hoping we get a lot of cool stuff this coming up year with Ravnica Allegiances and whatever follow-up sets and supplementary sets we get. So thank you, as always, for watching. I know this isn't scripted and it's a little awkward and I stumble over my speech, but hey, if you're hearing this, if you want to see more, make sure you subscribe to the channel here at Mana Rocks and tell people about it. They need to know that we exist. Also, find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks. Not that I actually use the Twitter very often, but that's because we don't have followers. Get us some followers and we'll use Twitter more often. Anyway, let me know what cards you loved from 2018, what cards you're going to miss drafting, and what cards you're hoping for in 2019. If you disagree with any of my cards, if you think they actually just suck and you didn't like playing against them, maybe they were too powerful, maybe they weren't powerful enough, maybe they're not memorable, let me know. Let's talk about it. So, with that being said, my name's Timothy here with Mana Rocks. Appreciate you spending the time out of your day to watch this. And as always, I'll see you next time.